Salem. The GPS told me to drive into the water. I almost drove straight into a lake because my GPS insisted there was a road there. The strange part, it happened while my best friend and I were trying to leave Salem on Halloween night. This actually happened a few years ago. At the time, my best friend was really interested in witchcraft. She'd spent a lot of time reading about it and learning different practices. Me? Not so much. I grew up religious, so it was never something I got into, but I was always fascinated by the history behind it. Since we only lived about 30 minutes from Salem, we figured we'd spend Halloween there. Honestly, it was exactly what you'd expect. The streets were packed. Everyone was dressed up. There were haunted attractions, museums, little shops, food vendors, people laughing everywhere. Nothing felt creepy. If anything, it just felt like one giant Halloween festival. At one of the little shops, I found this old ring with a deep red stone. It wasn't expensive, and I have no idea what it was made of. I just thought it looked unique, almost antique, so I bought it as a souvenir. My best friend laughed when she saw it. She said, "That's probably the most witchy thing I've ever seen you buy." I laughed it off. I wasn't buying it because of that, I just thought it looked cool. We forgot about it almost immediately and spent the rest of the evening walking around Salem. We stayed until about 9 or 10 that night before finally deciding it was time to head home. That's when everything changed. If you've ever been to Salem during Halloween, you already know. Getting out of town is a nightmare. Thousands of people all trying to leave at once. The GPS kept directing us toward the same line of traffic. Every route, every side street, every shortcut. It kept sending us back to the exact same place. We were stubborn. We kept thinking, there has to be another way. Every time we'd ignore the GPS, it'd recalculate and try to send us back. Then, out of nowhere, the screen changed. A faster route has been found. We looked at each other and just shrugged. Perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. So I followed it. The farther we drove, the quieter everything became. Within a couple of minutes, the crowds disappeared. Then the streetlights disappeared. Soon, it felt like we were the only car on the road. The GPS confidently kept telling us to continue straight. I remember driving faster than I probably should have been because I was irritated and just wanted to get home. Then, I don't know why, but something told me to slow down. Not because I saw something, not because my friend said anything. I just suddenly felt like I shouldn't keep driving that fast, so I eased off the gas. Thank God I did. Our headlights reached the end of the road, and instead of another street, there was nothing. Just black water stretching out in front of us. There wasn't a guardrail. There weren't flashing warning lights. Just one small sign off to the side that simply read, "Dead End." It would have been incredibly easy to miss if I'd kept driving the speed I was going. We both just sat there. Neither of us screamed. Neither of us said anything. We just stared through the windshield. Then I looked down at the GPS. It still said, "Continue straight." I remember slowly turning toward my best friend. She was already looking at me. Both of us had the exact same expression, completely confused. Finally, I said the only thing that made sense in that moment. "I feel like Salem doesn't want us to leave." She didn't laugh. She just nodded. That's what scared me the most. Normally we'd joke about something like that. This time, neither of us could. I slowly backed the car away from the water. The GPS calmly recalculated, as if nothing had happened. We decided to switch drivers, but I refused to get out of the car right there. Something about that road and that water made every instinct tell me to stay exactly where I was, so I carefully backed up until we reached a house a little farther away where I finally felt comfortable enough for us to switch. After that, she drove while I watched the GPS. The strange part was, now we couldn't even find the road we'd been trying to get back to. We kept circling the same quiet neighborhoods. The GPS signal would randomly disappear, then come back, then disappear again. We had full service. There was no reason for it to keep dropping. Eventually, we just gave up trying to outsmart the traffic. We just wanted to find people again. I honestly remember praying quietly to myself while staring out the window. A few minutes later, the GPS connected again. It finally brought us back to the main road, and for the first time all night, I was actually happy to be sitting in traffic. There were headlights, police directing cars, people walking. Everything suddenly felt normal. Neither of us talked very much on the drive back toward Boston. I think we were both still trying to process what had just happened. Then I glanced at the dashboard clock. At first I didn't think anything of it. A minute or two later I looked again. Something didn't feel right. I looked over at my friend and asked, "What time did we actually leave Salem?" She told me. I started doing the math in my head, then I checked my phone. The time matched. To both of us, it felt like we'd spent maybe 30 or 40 minutes trying to find another route, at the absolute most. But according to the clock, almost 2 hours had passed. We just looked at each other. Neither of us argued. Neither of us tried to explain it, because neither of us remembered where those other 90 minutes had gone. Looking back, we spent almost 2 hours trying to avoid traffic. Funny enough, I think that traffic was exactly where we were supposed to be. My grandfather spent 3 months doing a job he refused to tell anyone about. The only thing he would ever say was, "If anyone ever offers you work out on the open ocean, say no." Growing up, none of us understood why he hated the idea of anyone in our family working out at sea. He'd immediately shut down any conversation about joining the Navy, commercial fishing, or taking offshore jobs. We always figured he just didn't like the ocean. Years later, when he was much older, he finally told me why. Back when he was in his early 20s, money was really tight. He had a young family, bills piling up, and no idea how he was going to provide for them. Then, an old friend came to him with what sounded like the opportunity of a lifetime. 3 months, working on a fishing vessel. The pay was unbelievable. He would have made almost an entire year's salary before coming home. Looking back, he said the money should have been the first thing that made him suspicious. The first morning they left the harbor, the captain handed every new crew member a heavy pair of industrial headphones. He didn't explain what they were for, he just said that whenever he gave the order, they were to put them on immediately, and under absolutely no circumstances were they allowed to take them off. Nobody laughed. What really bothered my grandpa was that none of the older crew members looked surprised. They all grabbed their headphones, like this was just another normal day at work. For the first couple of days, nothing happened. He actually started thinking maybe the captain was just overly cautious. Then one morning, just after sunrise, everything changed. The captain calmly told everyone to put their headphones on. Within seconds, the entire crew was moving. The older guys didn't even look around. They already knew. A few moments later, my grandpa started hearing something, even through the headphones. He told me that he'd spent the rest of his life trying to figure out what that sound reminded him of, but he never could. It wasn't like anything he'd ever heard before. The best way he could describe it was a long, piercing screech that somehow made every part of him want to take those headphones off, not because he was curious, because something inside him genuinely felt like he needed to hear it. That's when the captain ordered all of the newer crew members to turn around and face away from the water. They weren't allowed to look. Instead, they were told to help pull whatever had been caught onto the boat while facing the opposite direction. My grandpa said whatever they were pulling was unbelievably heavy. It fought harder than any fish he'd ever imagined. The screech kept getting louder until it sounded like it was right beside them. Then, it suddenly stopped. A second later, something huge slammed onto the deck hard enough that the entire boat shook. Nobody turned around. Nobody spoke. Later that night, my grandpa finally cornered the friend who had gotten him the job. He kept asking what they'd actually been pulling onto the boat. At first, his friend wouldn't answer. Eventually, he gave in. He told my grandpa that the crews had different names for them. Most of the younger guys called them sirens, while some of the older fishermen still referred to them as the ones below. My grandpa actually laughed when he first heard it because he thought his friend was joking. He even asked, "You mean, like mermaids?" His friend just shook his head. Not the way the stories tell it. Then he explained something that stuck with my grandpa for the rest of his life. He said those boats went out several times every single year for one reason: to keep their population under control. The fewer there were, the less likely ordinary people were to ever come across one. My grandpa asked who could possibly be funding an operation like that. Those boats, those crews, the equipment. Someone had to be paying for all of it. His friend admitted he had no idea. Nobody ever told them. They were simply told where to go, what to do, and never to ask questions. The only other thing his friend warned him about was the headphones. He said if anyone ever took them off while that sound was happening, they'd belong to the sea. That was enough. My grandpa never asked another question. For the next 3 months, the same thing happened over and over again. The captain would give the order. Everyone put on their headphones. The screeching would start, something would come aboard, and nobody knew, ever looked. When those 3 months were finally over, my grandpa collected his money, got off that boat, and never stepped onto another one again. Now I finally understand why he never wanted anyone in our family working out on the open ocean. But if I'm being honest, his story also left me with one question I still can't answer. If crews like that really are out there, quietly doing that job several times every year, how many times have they already kept the rest of us from finding out what lives beneath the surface? And somehow, I think wondering about that scares me even more than the story itself. I still don't know why that thing let my friends leave the woods, but sometimes I wonder if it was never interested in them to begin with. This happened about 6 years ago, during my senior year of high school. Back then, my friends and I had this tradition. Every Friday or Saturday night, we'd grab our skateboards and spend the whole night exploring places we definitely had no business being in. Abandoned buildings, train tracks, old roads. If people said a place was creepy, we'd eventually end up there. One night, we wandered farther from town than we ever had before. That's when we found the trail. There wasn't a sign, no parking lot, nothing. Just this narrow dirt path disappearing into thick woods. The second I looked into those trees, something just felt wrong. I can't explain it. It wasn't fear. It was more like every instinct I had was telling me not to go in. My friends laughed, called me dramatic, and told me I'd regret staying behind. I told them I'd just skate around the woods and meet them at the gas station on the other side. It should have taken them maybe 20 or 25 minutes. I got to the gas station in a little over half an hour. They weren't there. I waited outside for a while before finally going in. I asked the cashier if he'd seen 3 teenagers come through. He looked out the window toward the woods for a second before asking, "Your friend's still back there?" I said, "Yeah." He just nodded. Then, almost like he was talking to himself, he quietly said, "I just hope they don't stop if they hear something." That was it. He didn't explain. He didn't elaborate. He just turned around and went back to stocking shelves like he hadn't said anything at all. At that point, I wasn't thinking about ghosts or monsters. I was just wondering why my friends were taking so long. About 15 minutes later, I started walking back toward the trail. I figured maybe they'd gotten lost. Then I heard running, heavy footsteps, 3 different people. A second later, my friends came flying around the back of the gas station so fast, one of them nearly slammed into the ice freezer. They looked exhausted, completely covered in sweat. One of them actually threw up in the parking lot before anybody even spoke. I've known those guys since elementary school. I'd never seen any of them look that terrified. None of them could get a sentence out. They just kept looking back toward the woods. It took almost 10 minutes before any of them could explain what had happened. At first, all they could say was that something had been following them. I figured it was another person, maybe somebody messing with them. They all shook their heads. One of them finally said that about halfway through the trail, they started hearing footsteps behind them. Every time they stopped, the footsteps stopped. Every time they started walking again, the footsteps came back. Eventually, one of them got tired of hearing it and turned around. That's when they saw it. He always struggled to describe it. The best he could ever do was say it was tall, completely white, and only vaguely shaped like a person. Not standing behind a tree, not hiding, just standing perfectly still in the middle of the trail, watching them. The second they saw it, they ran. At first they thought they'd lose it. Instead, they started hearing branches snapping beside them. Not behind them, beside them. Like whatever it was keeping pace through the woods without ever stepping onto the trail. They never actually saw it chasing them. They only heard it. Every few seconds, closer, 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 until they finally broke out of the tree line near the gas station. When they looked back, it was still there, standing at the edge of the woods. It never crossed onto the road. It just stood there watching them. None of us ever went back. For years, we barely even talked about that night. Every once in a while, it'd come up, and we'd all argue about the same thing. How long were they actually in those woods? To me, they'd only been gone 45 minutes. One friend swore they'd been running for almost an hour. Another insisted the whole thing couldn't have lasted more than 10 minutes. None of us could agree. Last year, one of those same friends was cleaning out his parents' garage when he found an old disposable camera from high school. There were only 3 pictures left on the roll. 2 were just random skateboarding pictures. The third one looked almost completely black. He almost threw it away. Instead, he scanned it and turned the brightness all the way up. You could barely make anything out. The trail, a few trees, my 3 friends running, and way back near the entrance, something standing perfectly still, tall, white, watching. At first, that picture didn't bother me. Then I noticed something. The figure wasn't watching my friends. It wasn't even facing the trail. It was looking toward the road, toward the place where I decided not to go into the woods. I've spent 6 years trying to convince myself that picture is just playing tricks on my eyes. The problem is, every time I look at it, I end up asking myself the same question. What would have happened if I'd gone into those woods with them? And for some reason, I don't think I would have come back.